The common and widespread metalhead mantra of "I only like their early stuff," usually accompanied by something like "when they were still playing good music" or "before they sold out," is kind of a multiple-edged sword. For example, when a fan of progressive death metal says that Soulside Journey is the only Darkthrone album he likes, it makes perfect sense to me. Behemoth makes sense too. I'm not a big fan of either of their eras, but the distinction between the old and the new is obvious. And there are other cases which seem to barely make any sense at all. I only like early My Dying Bride because their later stuff is too goth sounding. That's a common favorite. I mean, I only like early My Dying Bride as well, but the reasoning just seems silly. What is too goth sounding? Just because they are growled the vocals and death metal bits on as the flower withers, suddenly it isn't loaded with an explicit gothic aesthetic? The Kings of Undeserved Fame, Norwegian Wankmaster's Emperor, are another classic example. Emperor sold out after Anthems. You're shitting me. Or another favorite of mine, In Flames sold out after Colony. Yeah, fuck me dead, that must be a joke. Have these people ever even heard Colony? It has all the exact elements these same people criticize about the albums following it. Anyway, I digress. There is another option besides making sense and not making sense. Somewhat making sense. In this category, we can fit the people who claim In Flames were only good on their debut and sold out after it. That indeed somewhat makes sense, because their debut lacks all the superficial marks that would instantly brand it a commercial radio record. None of Anders Frieden's college rock style attempts at clean vocals here, none of those weird and consistently failing Depeche Mode style electronic elements, none of those frequent, ever annoying new wave of American Hot Topic garbage breakdowns, none of those childish, whiny Korn style "I hate my parents and nobody at school likes me" lyrics. Nothing that directly jumps out at you, unmistakably proclaiming its commercial intent. It's only beneath the surface that you discover that it's the same kind of shitty bubblegum pop they played after it and continue to play to this day. This album is what happens when you squeeze the worst elements of early melodic death metal, such as At the Gates, into the structures of Iron Maiden's dullest, straightforward rocking numbers like No Prayer or Fear of the Dark era, and puke some completely lifeless pseudo-death metal vocals over the whole mess. The songwriting department just sounds nerve-wrackingly desperate for cheap hooks. If only they could come up with their own ones. I have to be honest with you and admit that I wrote a large portion of this review from very distant memory, only from what I remembered from hearing the album just once, about 6 or 7 years ago. But then when I recently popped it in again just to check if my memory hadn't been distorted in some way, and if I might not be terribly wrong with my review, I suddenly had the feeling as if I had heard this album at least 200 times before. Everything about it is just so painfully over-recycled and then recycled again and then some. To make a gross estimation, I'd say about 40% of the leads are lifted straight from Iron Maiden, another 40% stolen from various European power metal bands from the era when power metal started to get all fluffy and flowery, and another 20% stolen from fellow Swedish melodic death metal acts to half-assedly pretend to harshen up things a bit, not succeeding the least bit, of course. Seriously, this is about as original as the gags in Spy Hard or all the other later era Leslie Nielsen movies trying to cash on the success of Police Squad and The Naked Gun. If you've heard Iron Maiden in late 1980s European power metal, you've pretty much heard this album. There's only two major differences. First, the vocals aren't melodic. They're just some bored scream without any substance to them. Nothing even worth elaborating on. Second, neither Iron Maiden nor late 80s European power metal, which I don't even like, have that bad of a tendency to drone on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Seriously, whenever In Flames found a lead harmony they seem to think is digestible enough for the smallest common denominator of all people remotely interested in metal music, they noodle on it for hours and hours and never ever bother to stop until you think you're stuck in a condensed version of Groundhog Day where you live through the same 10 seconds over and over again, never being able to escape, except of course if you manage to find Andy McDowell and manage to make her fall in love with you. Good luck accomplishing that when the loop starts over every 10 seconds. Just goddamn annoying how repetitive it is. The lyrics are another matter worthy. I don't like to use the word worthy because I feel dirty for using that word in a description of this album. Worthy of mention. To be honest, they are actually the best lyrics In Flames have ever put out. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean anything positive at all. These lyrics are pretty much the type that happens when a band wants to distance itself from the typical gore or occult stuff usually connected to death metal, but doesn't really have a clue what to replace it with, ending up with lyrics that don't really say anything at all. An album I mentioned earlier in this review, Darkthrone's Soulside Journey, that's kind of an offender in this field. But at least Darkthrone's lyrics sounded good. Other ones on this album are not only completely meaningless, but sound completely stupid too. In Darkthrone's case, I simply think the band wanted to explore less stereotypical subjects, while In Flames seemed to deliberately tone down the violence and occultism in order to be less offensive. It would certainly fit the pattern of this album, and I can really not think of a better explanation for the catastrophe these lyrics are. And like I said before, this album features the best lyrics of any In Flames album, which makes it all the sadder. Alright, so at this point I've made enough references to market orientation of the band and them only being in it to be big sellers, and that I can already hear the outraged detractors telling me if they wanted to make it big, they wouldn't play death metal, they'd play pop. Yeah, I love the ever-recurring argument that tame pop is the only way to make money off music. I think people who keep coming up with that rubbish need some one-on-one time with Lars Ulrich. I mean, sure, run-of-the-mill pop music still plays the largest of roles in the mainstream, but there's another side to it. Pop music is almost exclusively created by the record companies themselves. They just put a pretty face on what they have already worked out. People who want to be big sellers by themselves are an entirely different beast, and that field of the mainstream can pretty much assume the face of any genre, just as long as it's being watered down enough, ultra-aggressively marketed and hell-bent on catering to every whim on what's hip with the kids. Seriously, the whole pseudo-argument that people who want to be big sellers wouldn't play supposedly extreme music is nothing but an exercise in self-defeat. Because there have been so many precedences in rock history that disprove the whole assumption. I can perfectly picture these people in 1984 after the release of Ride the Lightning claiming that it's impossible that Metallica want to make it big, because if they did, they would play glam rock. The truth of the matter is that any style of music can make big sales if it's just watered down enough for a broad majority to enjoy. And be honest and tell me, if something like Slipknot makes it on the radio, why not something far slower with more accessible melodies and much tamer vocals? Oh right, because melodic death metal is wicked underground, as Seth Putnam would call it. Yeah. Anyway, I digress again, because in the end all it really boils down to is inspiration. After all, there are other bands that made it blatantly obvious that their prime interest is to make it big. Metallica for a prime example, or Iron Maiden is another famous one. However, you don't see me dishing out minimum rating reviews to ride the lightning or peace of mind. The comparison to those two classic bands highlight the major flaws in the modus operandi of In Flames' aspiration to platinum records and sold-out arenas. The obvious difference between In Flames and the world's two most famous metal bands is that the latter didn't play it by the numbers, and most certainly did not recycle rehashed material that had already been recycled a dozen times over before In Flames do. They gave something to the metal community and the genre as a whole, and worked the collective asses off doing so, and received the well-earned revenue in return. You might not personally like the music of Metallica or Iron Maiden, but the impact they had on metal with their original, bordering revolutionary styles is pretty much indisputable. And Flames have no impact whatsoever, beyond that everybody and their dogs knows their name, simply because they don't bring anything to metal. They take the easy road, without the hard work or required inspiration, and simply throw some radio-friendly whistle-along leads together into simple enough tunes that even the simplest of simpletons wouldn't find any bothersome edge to stumble over. And then they try to sell it as their own creation. Sorry, that's not metal. That's more like a Sweden's Idol. I'm sorry, I know many of you younger people first discovered the beautiful beast that is metal through this abomination of a band. Whatever happened to Metallica and Iron Maiden being the gateway bands anyway? You try to justify your misdirected feelings of nostalgia by defending yourself with the "I only like the early stuff before they sold out" mantra. But it really falls flat in the case of this band, because when they sold out was the moment they started the band. It's been lifeless, uninspired, whistle-along radio bubblegum pop from the very start. There's no way around it. Anyone looking for metal should better look elsewhere. This album is among the worst possible things you can do to yourself. Because the only way you can think that this has any balls is if you directly compare it to Christian metalcore or maybe Andy Darius era Halloween. Compared to actual metal, this is pretty much on one level with Modern Talking. Search YouTube if you don't know that band and note the obvious similarities in their approach to music. It's just as annoying. Just avoid this. Just avoid.